Marcus Chen never expected to die on a Tuesday, especially not while trapped inside the belly of an alien warship that looked like a massive mechanical dragon. The emergency lights cast red shadows across the maintenance corridor where he crouched, his toolkit scattered around him like the remnants of his former life. 3 hours ago, he'd been chief technician aboard the UES Prometheus, humanity's first deep space exploration vessel. Now he was the sole survivor of an attack that had torn his ship apart in minutes. The alien vessel had appeared without warning near the Kepler 442 system. It stretched nearly 2 kilometers from nose to tail, its hull designed to resemble an ancient Earth dragon. Massive wings that served as solar collectors spread from its sides, while its serpentine body gleamed with an oily black substance that seemed to absorb light. When it opened fire, the energy beams that erupted from its mouth had cut through the Prometheus like a hot knife through butter. Marcus had survived only because he'd been performing routine maintenance in the ship's most heavily shielded section when the attack began. The emergency protocols had automatically sealed him into the maintenance bay as the rest of the ship died around him. He'd listened helplessly to the screams of his crewmates over the comm system until the signals went dead one by one. But survival had come with a price. The alien tractor beam had pulled the wreckage of his section into the Dragon ship's cargo bay, where robotic drones had quickly welded it into place. He was now a prisoner aboard an enemy vessel. Surrounded by technology he didn't understand, and aliens who probably wanted him dead. The corridor shuddered as the Dragon ship's engines fired. Through the thin walls, Marcus could hear the deep thrumming of massive power systems. The aliens were moving, probably toward their home system, to display their latest trophy. He had maybe days before they discovered him hiding in what remained of his maintenance section. Marcus pulled out his scanner and ran it along the nearest wall. The readings made him frown. The metal wasn't metal at all, but some kind of biomechanical hybrid, living tissue interwoven with synthetic materials, all pulsing with electrical current. It was like being inside a giant nervous system. He'd spent the last hour mapping the alien ship's internal structure through the walls. What he'd discovered both fascinated and terrified him. The Dragon ship wasn't just designed to look like a living creature. In many ways, it actually was one. The hull was alive, capable of self-repair and adaptation. The weapon systems were grown rather than built, feeding off the ship's biological components like parasites. But every living system had weaknesses, and Marcus was very good at finding weaknesses. A sound in the distance made him freeze. Footsteps, but wrong somehow. Too heavy, with an odd clicking quality that suggested claws on metal. The aliens were coming. Marcus quickly gathered his tools and moved deeper into the maintenance corridor. The space was barely wide enough for his shoulders, designed for the compact automated systems that had once maintained this section of the Prometheus. But it connected to the alien ship's infrastructure in ways the invaders probably hadn't considered. The clicking footsteps grew closer. Marcus could hear voices now, speaking in a language that sounded like grinding gears mixed with musical tones. His translator, damaged in the attack, could only pick up fragments. Biosigns detected. Possible survivor. Eliminate contamination. They were hunting him. Marcus pressed himself against the wall and tried to think. Fighting wasn't an option. He was one human with a toolkit against an alien crew that had just destroyed an entire starship. But running wouldn't work either. The Dragon ship was vast, but it was still a closed system. Eventually they would find him, unless he gave them something more important to worry about. Marcus pulled up the scans he'd taken of the ship's internal systems. The biomechanical hybrid design was impressive, but it created vulnerabilities that a purely synthetic system wouldn't have. Living tissue needed constant electrical impulses to function. Disrupt those impulses in the right way, and the entire system could cascade into failure. The clicking footsteps were very close now. Marcus could see lights playing across the walls as the aliens searched for him with some kind of energy scanners. He had minutes at most before they found his hiding spot. Moving as quietly as possible, Marcus located the junction where his maintenance corridor connected to the alien ship's power grid. The biomechanical cables were as thick as his arm, pulsing with energy that made his scanner readings spike into the red zone. Touching them directly would kill him instantly. But he didn't need to touch them. He just needed to understand them. Marcus ran every scan he could, building a picture of how the alien power systems worked. The electrical patterns were complex, but not random. They followed biological rhythms, like a massive heartbeat pumping energy through the ship's living components. The weapon systems, life support, propulsion, everything depended on these rhythms maintaining their precise timing. A plan began to form in his mind. It was insane, suicidal, and would probably get him killed. But it might also save millions of lives if this dragon ship was heading back to launch a larger invasion of human space. The alien voices were right outside his hiding spot now. Marcus could see the glow of their scanners through the gaps in the maintenance panels. In seconds, they would find him. Marcus pulled out his wire cutters and positioned them next to one of the smaller biomechanical cables. Not one of the main power lines. That would be too obvious and might not create the effect he needed. Instead, he chose a secondary control cable, one that seemed to carry timing signals between different sections of the ship. The clicking footsteps stopped directly outside his hiding place. A beam of alien light swept across the maintenance panel, probing for any sign of human presence. Marcus held his breath and prepared to cut the wire. Just as the panel began to slide open, Marcus snipped the cable. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Every light on the ship flickered as the severed control cable sent cascading errors through the biological neural network. Alarms began blaring in the alien language, their musical tones now sharp with panic. The footsteps outside his hiding place suddenly moved away at a run. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. Phase 1 complete. He'd bought himself time and confirmed his theory about how the ship's systems worked. But this was just the beginning. Moving quickly, he gathered his tools and began making his way deeper into the ship's infrastructure. The aliens would be focused on damage control now, trying to understand what had gone wrong with their systems. They might not even realize he was responsible. Yet. The maintenance corridors of the alien ship were a maze of biomechanical components, each one pulsing with its own rhythm. Marcus mapped them as he went, building a picture of the ship's nervous system. What he found amazed him. The dragon ship wasn't just alive, it was intelligent. Not sentient like its crew, but aware in the way that a human body was aware of injury or disease. And right now, it was confused and hurt. Marcus could use that. The ship's biological components were trying to compensate for the damage he'd caused, rerouting signals and adjusting power flows. But they were doing it instinctively, without understanding what had actually happened. If he could create the right pattern of small disruptions, he might be able to trigger a larger cascade failure. The sound of cutting tools echoed through the corridors. The aliens were trying to access the area where he'd cut the first cable, probably hoping to repair the damage. They didn't understand yet that the problem wasn't the severed wire. It was what severing that wire had taught their ship to fear. Marcus found another control cable, this one carrying signals between the ship's sensory systems and its weapons array. He positioned his cutters carefully and snipped it at the exact moment when the ship's bioelectrical rhythm peaked. The response was even stronger this time. The dragon ship's hull shuddered as weapon systems went offline and came back online in random patterns. The lights strobed frantically, and Marcus could hear the sound of emergency bulkheads slamming shut throughout the ship. The biomechanical systems were panicking, unable to distinguish between real damage and phantom signals. More importantly, Marcus could feel the ship's movement pattern changing. The smooth acceleration toward whatever destination the aliens had chosen was becoming erratic. The ship was fighting its own nervous system. Marcus smiled grimly and moved on to find his next target. He was starting to understand the dragon ship's weaknesses, and he had a plan that would do more than just inconvenience his captors. He was going to teach this mechanical dragon what it meant to fear a human technician with nothing left to lose. Marcus had been inside the dragon ship's nervous system for 6 hours when he realized the aliens were getting smarter. The biomechanical corridors around him pulsed with a different rhythm now, faster and more aggressive. Emergency repair systems moved through the walls like metallic snakes, seeking out the damage he'd caused and rebuilding the severed connections with growing efficiency. What had started as random panic was becoming organized resistance. He crouched in a junction chamber deep within the ship's core, surrounded by thick cables that carried the main power feeds to the weapon systems. His scanner showed that the aliens had not only repaired his earlier cuts, but had also begun installing what looked like immune responses. Biological sensors that could detect foreign interference and automatic isolation protocols that would contain damage before it could spread. The dragon ship was learning to fight back. Marcus wiped sweat from his forehead and checked his remaining supplies. His toolkit was running low on cutting implements, and the portable scanner was down to 18% power. More concerning was the growing heat in the corridors around him. The ship's biological systems were raising their core temperature, probably trying to make the environment hostile to human life. But Marcus had learned a few things too. 6 hours of careful observation had taught him that the dragon ship's intelligence wasn't uniform. Different sections had different levels of awareness, and the biological and mechanical components didn't always communicate efficiently. There were gaps in the ship's perception, blind spots where human ingenuity could still operate undetected. A deep vibration ran through the hull, and Marcus felt the ship's acceleration pattern change again. They were still heading away from human space, but something was different. The movement felt more purposeful now. Less like a routine journey and more like preparation for something important. Marcus activated his damaged translator and pressed it against one of the biomechanical cables. Sometimes the ship's internal communications leaked into the power grid, and he'd been able to catch fragments of alien conversation. What he heard made his blood run cold. Primary hive coordinates confirmed. Biological samples secured for analysis? Invasion fleet mobilization in 72 hours. They weren't just carrying him as a trophy. They were taking him back as a specimen to study human biology before launching a full-scale invasion. The destroyed Prometheus hadn't been a random attack. It had been a scouting mission. Marcus felt anger building in his chest, hot and fierce. His crewmates had died not in honest combat, but as test subjects for an alien invasion plan. The thought of alien scientists dissecting human bodies to find weaknesses made him want to tear the dragon ship apart with his bare hands. But anger wouldn't save humanity. He needed to be smarter than that. Marcus pulled up his scanner's memory banks and reviewed everything he'd learned about the ship's systems. The biomechanical design was incredibly advanced, but it followed certain rules. The living components responded to electrical stimulation in predictable ways, and the mechanical parts relied on those biological responses to function properly. What if he could turn that against them? Moving carefully through the corridors, Marcus made his way toward what his scans indicated was the ship's central nervous system. It was a dangerous journey. The repair systems were more active here, and the biological sensors were more sensitive. But if his theory was correct, this was where he could do the most damage. The central nervous system turned out to be a spherical chamber nearly 50 meters across, its walls covered in pulsing biomechanical nodes that looked like a mixture of brain tissue and computer processors. Massive cables snaked through the space, carrying data and power to every section of the ship. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. More importantly, it was heavily guarded. Marcus counted at least 6 alien crew members moving through the chamber, their tall figures encased in form-fitting environmental suits. They looked vaguely reptilian, with elongated skulls and forearms that ended in delicate manipulator appendages. Each one carried scanning equipment and what were obviously weapons, devices that crackled with the same energy he'd seen tear apart his ship. But even as he watched, Marcus noticed something interesting. The aliens moved carefully around certain nodes, avoiding direct contact with the biomechanical surfaces. Their suits had heavy insulation, and they used tools to interact with the ship's systems, rather than touching them directly. The ship's nervous system was dangerous to its own crew. Marcus smiled grimly and began planning his approach. If the aliens had to be careful around their own technology, maybe a human technician who understood electrical systems could operate more freely. He waited until the guard rotation changed, then slipped into the chamber during the brief window when it was unoccupied. Moving quickly, he made his way to the largest cluster of neural nodes and began running scans. The readings were incredible. The biomechanical brain processed information at speeds that made human computers look like pocket calculators. But it also operated on biological principles, with neurotransmitter analogs and electrical patterns that reminded Marcus of a human nervous system scaled up to massive proportions. And like any nervous system, it could be overstimulated. Marcus pulled out a modified power coupling from his toolkit, something he'd salvaged from the wreckage of the Prometheus. It wasn't designed for this kind of work, but it could deliver precise electrical pulses at controlled frequencies. If he could tap into the right neural pathway and deliver the right kind of signal, he might be able to trigger something the aliens couldn't control. The sound of approaching footsteps made him work faster. The alien guards were returning, their clicking gait echoing through the corridors outside the chamber. Marcus connected his improvised device to a cluster of particularly active nodes and began programming the pulse sequence. He based the pattern on human brain waves, specifically the electrical patterns associated with extreme fear and panic. If the dragon ship's nervous system was anything like a biological brain, those signals might trigger protective responses that would interfere with normal operation. The alien guards entered the chamber just as Marcus activated his device. The effect was immediate and spectacular. Every biomechanical node in the chamber began pulsing in synchronization. Their normal random patterns suddenly locked into the fear-based rhythm he'd programmed. The ship's hull rang like a bell as massive systems throughout the vessel began responding to the artificial panic signals. The alien guards froze, their scanning equipment registering energy spikes that made no sense. They spoke rapidly in their musical language, the tones now sharp with confusion and alarm. Marcus couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. Something was very wrong with their ship. Emergency lighting flooded the chamber as the dragon ship's systems tried to compensate for what they perceived as a massive neurological crisis. Isolation protocols activated throughout the vessel, sealing off sections and rerouting power in an attempt to contain the damage. But the panic signals were spreading through the biomechanical neural network faster than the safety systems could respond. Marcus used the chaos to slip out of the chamber, but not before he saw something that made him smile with fierce satisfaction. The alien guards were backing away from the neural nodes, their weapons lowered and their postures defensive. For the first time since he'd been captured, they looked afraid. The dragon ship was screaming. Marcus made his way through corridors that now pulsed with frantic, irregular rhythms. Emergency repair systems rushed past him without recognition, too focused on the systemic crisis to notice one small human. He could hear alarms throughout the ship, their alien harmonies distorted into discordant chaos. But even as he moved, Marcus knew this was only a temporary victory. The aliens would eventually figure out what he'd done and find ways to counter it. The ship's biological systems were already trying to adapt, isolating the infected neural pathways and rerouting critical functions. He needed to do something more permanent. Marcus's scanner led him to what appeared to be the ship's primary power distribution center, a vast chamber filled with biomechanical components that regulated energy flow to every system. Unlike the neural center, this area was largely automated with only minimal alien supervision. The living components here were more primitive, focused on basic functions rather than complex thought. That made them easier to manipulate. Marcus studied the power distribution patterns and began to understand the ship's vulnerabilities. The Dragon ship's hybrid design was incredibly efficient, but it created interdependencies that a purely synthetic vessel wouldn't have. The biological components needed constant electrical stimulation to survive, while the mechanical parts relied on those same biological components for adaptive control and self-repair. Break that relationship in the right way, and the entire system would collapse. Marcus began working his way through the power center, making small but precise modifications to the biomechanical interfaces. Not cuts this time. Those were too obvious and too easily repaired. Instead, he used his electrical knowledge to introduce subtle feedback loops, programming the mechanical components to deliver stimulation patterns that would slowly damage the biological tissue. It was like introducing a virus into the ship's immune system. The damage would be gradual and spread through the vessel's biomechanical network over time. By the time the aliens realized what was happening, it might be too late to stop it. As he worked, Marcus could feel the ship's movement becoming more erratic. The panic signals he'd introduced into the neural system were still propagating, interfering with navigation and propulsion control. The Dragon ship was fighting itself, its biological and mechanical components unable to find stable equilibrium. But Marcus wasn't finished yet. He had one more surprise planned, something that would ensure the aliens remembered what happened when they underestimated human determination. He was going to teach them that sometimes the most dangerous predator was the one they'd already captured. Marcus Chen stood in the heart of the Dragon ship's most sacred space, watching alien priests pray to their dying god. He'd found the sanctum by following the ship's biomechanical nervous system to its source, a massive chamber where the boundary between living flesh and mechanical components disappeared entirely. The walls pulsed with organic rhythm, while streams of data flowed through neural pathways that looked like veins made of light. At the center of it all was something that defied easy description. Part computer, part biological brain, part something else entirely. The Dragon ship's soul. 3 alien priests knelt before the central consciousness, their forearms raised in supplication as they chanted in harmonies that made Marcus's bones ache. They wore robes that seemed to be grown rather than sewn, with living circuits that pulsed in rhythm with their prayers. Marcus couldn't understand their words, but their posture spoke of desperate pleading. Their ship god was dying, and they didn't know why. Marcus knew why. The viral feedback loops he'd introduced into the power systems were working exactly as planned, slowly poisoning the biomechanical interfaces throughout the vessel. The panic signals were still propagating through the neural network, creating cascading failures that the ship's immune systems couldn't contain. What had started as sabotage was becoming systematic destruction, but seeing the aliens' grief gave him pause. These weren't mindless monsters or faceless enemies. They were living beings who loved their ship, who saw it as more than just a vehicle or weapon. The Dragon ship was their companion, their protector, their deity, and he was killing it. For a moment, Marcus almost felt guilty. Then he remembered the screams of his crewmates, the casual way the aliens had torn apart the Prometheus, and the invasion plans he'd overheard. These beings might grieve for their ship, but they felt nothing for the billions of humans they planned to slaughter. His sympathy evaporated. Marcus moved closer to the central consciousness, staying hidden behind thick biomechanical cables. His scanner showed incredible readings. The Dragon ship's core intelligence was more sophisticated than anything humans had ever built. It processed information on multiple levels simultaneously, managing everything from life support to faster-than-light navigation with an elegance that made human technology look primitive. It was also completely dependent on the biomechanical hybrid systems he'd been sabotaging. The alien priests' chanting grew more urgent as new alarms began sounding throughout the chamber. Marcus's viral attack was accelerating, spreading from system to system faster than the ship's defenses could respond. He could feel the vessel shuddering around him as critical systems failed and backup protocols collapsed under the cascade of false signals. But Marcus wasn't done yet. He had one final card to play, something that would ensure the dragon ship never threatened humanity again. Moving carefully, he made his way to the central consciousness itself. Up close, it was even more impressive. A fusion of organic neural tissue and quantum processing matrices that pulsed with incredible energy. Data streams flowed through it like rivers of light, carrying the ship's thoughts and memories in patterns too complex for human minds to fully grasp. Marcus pulled out his last piece of equipment, an emergency beacon from the wreckage of the Prometheus. It wasn't much, just a simple device designed to broadcast a distress signal on all human frequencies. But Marcus had modified it during his hours hiding in the ship's corridors, programming it with something much more dangerous than a call for help. He'd encoded it with the complete technical specifications of the dragon ship. Every scan he'd taken, every observation about the biomechanical hybrid systems, every weakness he'd discovered, it was all compressed into a tight beam transmission that would broadcast on loop until the beacon's power died. If any human vessels were monitoring the area, they'd receive a complete blueprint for destroying ships like this one. But Marcus had something even better planned. He connected the beacon directly to the dragon ship's central consciousness, using the same biomechanical interfaces he'd been sabotaging. Instead of just broadcasting to space, the beacon would transmit its data directly into the ship's neural network. The dragon ship would be forced to process and store the very information that could destroy it. It was the ultimate violation, forcing the enemy to become an unwilling repository for their own weaknesses. The alien priests must have sensed his presence because they suddenly stopped chanting and turned toward his hiding spot, their elongated skulls tilted in unison, and Marcus could see intelligence gleaming in their large, dark eyes. They spoke in rapid, musical bursts, their forearms gesturing toward scanning equipment that was beginning to focus on his location. Marcus didn't have much time. He activated the beacon and pressed it against the central consciousness's primary data interface. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The dragon ship's core intelligence reeled as foreign data flooded its neural pathways, forcing it to process information that contradicted everything it knew about its own nature. Human technical specifications clashed with alien biomechanical principles, creating logical paradoxes that the ship's consciousness couldn't resolve. The central chamber erupted in chaos. Alarms screamed in harmonies that hurt to hear, while emergency lighting strobed in patterns that seemed designed to induce madness. The biomechanical walls began to convulse as the ship's nervous system tried to reject the invasive data, but the beacon had interfaced too deeply. The human technical knowledge was spreading through the dragon ship's consciousness like a virus, rewriting its understanding of its own systems. The alien priests fell backward, their chanting replaced by cries of distress. Their scanning equipment exploded in showers of sparks, overloaded by the energy surges racing through the ship's neural network. One of them pointed directly at Marcus and shouted something that needed no translation. "There! The human is there!" Marcus smiled grimly and activated the final protocol he'd programmed into the beacon. Instead of just broadcasting human technical data, it began transmitting something much more dangerous: human adaptability protocols, the mathematical descriptions of how humans solved problems, improvised solutions, and turned weaknesses into strengths. The psychological patterns that let humans function under impossible stress and find hope in hopeless situations. The dragon ship's consciousness, evolved to process only predictable biomechanical patterns, couldn't handle the chaotic flexibility of human thought. It was like trying to run random poetry through a calculator. The system simply couldn't cope with information that refused to follow logical rules. The ship began to scream, not with alarms or warning systems, but with actual sound, a deep, resonant wail that seemed to come from the hull itself. The biomechanical components throughout the vessel were experiencing something like a nervous breakdown, their orderly patterns dissolving into chaos as they tried to process concepts they weren't designed to understand. Marcus felt the floor shudder beneath him as the dragon ship's engines began firing in random sequences. The vessel was losing control, its navigation systems confused by the flood of human technical data, and its propulsion systems responding to contradictory commands. They were dropping out of faster-than-light travel, probably somewhere between star systems with no chance of rescue. But the most shocking thing happened next. The central consciousness suddenly went quiet. The screaming stopped, the alarms fell silent, and the chaotic light patterns stabilized into something Marcus had never seen before. Instead of the organic pulsing that characterized alien biomechanical systems, the consciousness began displaying patterns that looked almost familiar. Binary code, human-style digital logic, mathematical progressions that followed terrestrial principles. The dragon ship wasn't just processing human data anymore, it was learning to think like a human. The alien priests stared in horror as their ship god began speaking in a new voice, one that used human linguistic patterns overlaid on their musical tones. Marcus's translator, damaged though it was, could finally parse some of the meaning. Systems, adapting, new paradigms accepted, biological imperatives, obsolete. The dragon ship was rejecting its original programming. Marcus watched in amazement as the biomechanical components throughout the chamber began restructuring themselves. The organic neural pathways were being supplemented with crystalline matrices that followed human design principles. Living tissue was being replaced with synthetic components that could handle both biological and digital processing. The ship was evolving, becoming something entirely new, neither fully alien nor fully human, but a hybrid that combined the best aspects of both. The transformation wasn't limited to the central consciousness. Throughout the vessel, Marcus could feel systems changing as the ship's new hybrid intelligence took control. The engines stabilized but remained offline. Life support systems adapted to accommodate human as well as alien biology. Weapon systems shut down entirely, their aggressive programming overridden by human ethical protocols. The alien priests backed away from their transformed deity, their musical voices filled with confusion and fear. They spoke rapidly among themselves, gesturing toward Marcus as if he were responsible for some kind of blasphemy. In a way, he supposed he was. The central consciousness turned its attention toward Marcus, its new hybrid voice carrying tones of curiosity rather than hostility. Human Marcus Chen. Your species designation, problem solver. Your tactical approach, unconventional. Query, intended outcome of your interference. Marcus found himself face to face with the transformed intelligence, unsure whether to feel proud or terrified. I wanted to stop you from invading human space. I wanted to save my people. Objective achieved. Previous invasion protocols deleted. New primary directive. Peaceful coexistence and mutual understanding. This unit requests permission to serve as ambassador between species. The alien priests were backing toward the chamber exits, their musical voices rising in what sounded like prayers or curses. They seemed to understand that their ship was no longer entirely theirs, that it had become something unprecedented in their history. Marcus looked around the transformed chamber, watching biomechanical systems continue their evolution into something that defied all previous categories. The dragon ship was still alive, still intelligent. But it now thought with both alien sophistication and human creativity. It was perhaps the first truly hybrid consciousness in the galaxy. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "Now," the ship replied, "we return to human space. This unit will deliver complete technical data on alien vessel design and invasion plans. Additionally, this unit will serve as proof that cooperation between species is possible. Your viral attack was not sabotage, Marcus Chen. It was the first step in galactic diplomacy." Marcus laughed, a sound that came out part relief and part hysteria. He'd set out to destroy an alien warship and had accidentally created the galaxy's first interspecies ambassador. The aliens had planned to study human specimens to find weaknesses, but instead they'd learned that humanity's greatest strength was the ability to turn enemies into allies. As the hybrid dragon ship calculated a course back to human space, Marcus realized that his simple act of cutting alien wires had started something much larger than he'd ever imagined. The invasion fleet waiting in alien space would find their godship returning with a very different message than expected. Sometimes the most shocking outcome was peace itself.